Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the War Report, the second episode in post-democracy America. It is really a new era. I should wipe the slate clean and start numbering the shows from zero from now on because this is how unprecedented things are right now. And I know there was a little bit of delay. Rest assured, that was not because of any scheduling conflicts. We were just both coping with the loss of democracy and strong women of color. You have
Oh
to know
yeah.
how hard it was on us as Biden supporters, first off, okay? Because you'll remember back in 2020, go through our archives, we were ardent Biden supporters. We were his biggest fans, okay? We couldn't get enough of him. And then when we heard Harris was running, we were like, this is so much better. And then when she lost,
Yes.
I'm sure you've been able to tell the past 3 months. It's been like 3 months at this point. We were
Yeah.
just devastated. Okay,
De-
I was
Depression around the clock.
I was so devastated that I was hoping to be part of Trump's deportation orders to the USSR or Yugoslavia. Real records, by the way. If you look those up with ICE, they had people slated for deportation to Yugoslavia and the USSR. And I was like, at that point, I was like, Donald Trump listens to the War Report. What else? What else? I made that joke last episode. Did I make that on air? Or did I make that to you? I can't remember whether I.
We're gonna make the war report great again.
You know what?
We're
We are.
gonna give the
But for context, not to filibuster too long here. What I told you off air and what I said on inauguration day in IRL circle, which was funny because nobody picked up on the joke at first, is like right after Trump got inaugurated, I said I can't take this. I'm moving to the Soviet Union, and yeah, no nobody picked up on the joke. I thought it was good. I think you guys probably think it's good. But speaking of the Soviet Union and the fallout thereof, I suppose we do have a lot of Ukraine news. So I'm gonna stop.
Yeah, we do a lot of frontline news. It's been a while since the last show. So why don't we begin with Pokrov's front? And I've circled where Pokrovsk is, and I've also done a little linear, this vertical line, and that is to highlight the new trench networks that the Ukrainians have built to stop tanks from going further into going into Dnepr, because there are now about 4 or 5 kilometers in some areas to Dnepr. As you can see in this icon, or this screen cap rather, where the fighting has been taking place. The next slide will show you a close up of it. And this is an area that is halfway between Pokrovsk and Kurakovo, or by now the Russians have already reached Andreevka. They're well past Kurakovo in most of the areas, and now they've gained territory in Srebny, and they've taken over the village of Srebny. Now there are reports tonight, because this map is a day old already, and we're recording on Tuesday, so people are looking at this on Wednesday. So the map is subject to change.
And one thing I will point out, if you look to the left-hand side of the map, you'll see the oblast borders right there.
Yes,
So
that's
that's how
right.
close it is.
Yes, so they're about 4 or 5 kilometers from the oblast. Now, I personally don't think that the Russians are going to make a beeline for the Dnieper. I Simply because they would need much more resources. Remember that today, the Ukrainians announced that they're going to free up 50,000 troops that are in other areas in Ukraine from all branches of the military. Now, even drone operators have been sent to the front, and pilots. And a Ukrainian pilot was recently killed a couple of days ago when his SU-27 was shot down. So they are going to make a push somewhere on the front line. It could be in an unusual spot. Some people are claiming that it's going to be in the Kursk region, where there's those two little plots of land that the Russians took back in May and June, late May, early June of 2024. We'll get to it when we come to those maps. Further down, you can see what the advances have been like for the Russians in the Kurakovo area. So You can see that they've moved much further out west. They're on the outskirts of Andreevka, and they're pushing from the south as well towards Constantinople, the other Constantinople. Hmm. The Constantinople you've never heard of
Yes,
before,
yes.
before the war report. Um,
So it's like a Rome, Ohio kind of situation for those of you who are curious.
mhm.
But hey, Russian army enters. Well, I suppose enters Constantinople. That's a good headline. Okay, we're not going to pass that up.
So you can see now what has happened. The Russians have basically again encircled the Ukrainians in this area. Now, the last time they did this, when the Russians took over Kurahovo, um, the Ukrainians dodged the bullet. They managed to get most of their men out, and but that isn't the case for what happened in Velika Novoselovka. When we get to it, I'll explain what happened. But the next slide is a blow up of one of the areas that is the Ukrainians are still stubbornly holding on to, and that's the village of Dakhne, or Dachne, in just outside of Kurahovo. Uh, the next slide is just ignore the next slide. It's well, yeah, and you know what? Put it up, because I'm going to show you another area where the Ukrainians have pushed the Russians out. So, of course, that circle there is Pokrovsk. You can see that the Russians are gaining more and more territory west of Pokrovsk and south of Pokrovsk. They eventually want to circle this. I think they understand that there's going to be a tremendous fight for uh, for Pokrovsk. The next slide will show you the territory where the Russians were pushed back a few kilometers from a village that is um, difficult for them to resupply. There is a river there, but the territories around it have been gained in the last week or two. They're no longer highlighted because this map, after a few weeks, it doesn't show you the gains anymore. But anyhow, so there's the area where where the Ukrainians, Lisivka, where they've managed to push out the Russians. But the other villages like Zelenye, Dashnevka, those were recently captured by the Russians. In any case, let's keep moving. The Liman front. The Russian, we've explained many times, this is a difficult situation for them, but they keep extending the salient that you see here. And they've recently taken over some fortifications. I've circled Liman so you understand where it is. Liman is another one of those very important hubs. This is an area that the Russians controlled back in 2022, before Ukraine's late summer offensive at the beginning of September in the Kursk region, and rolled back the Russians. This is when the Russians didn't have mobilization, and they decided to go in with somewhere between 150 and 175,000 troops. So now, I always said back then, like, it would cost thousands of lives for the decision not to go in with a bigger army, and I think I was right about that, sadly. The next slide will show you a blow up of the trench networks that the Russians have taken. Like I said, they've made several gains here. They took over Terni. Terni, remember, was one of those towns on the right bank of the Zherebets River. Those water reservoirs that you see are part of the Zherebets River. Uh, and further west is the Oskol River. So you can see that the Russians are still advancing here, and Terney, I imagine now, will be a hub for Russian drone operators. This will give them more leverage when they attack towards Liman. but they will have to use some kind of drones that are, I would say, in excess of 15-kilometer range. The next slide is the Kupiansk front. And you can see that the Russians still hold on to this salient below Kupiansk, but the Ukrainians have managed to push them back a little bit. That's what the blue outline that you see. I've circled Kupiansk just so you know where it is. It's situated right on the Oskol River. This area is north of the area that we were just looking at when I mentioned Terny and the Zherebets River. So, but the Russians have reached the Oskol, and you can see what's developing here is another sort of fire bag for the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians for months have tried to push the Russians out from this area. They know how important it is, but the Russians are still holding on. I imagine there's very brutal fighting happening in this sector. The other important thing to think about when you're looking at Kupiansk is that the Russians have crossed the Oskol River north of Kupiansk in the Kharkov region, and we will get to that. So the next slide basically shows you the area that the Russians did not control up until a couple of months ago. Everything on the left side of this red outline are the gains that the Russians have been making north of Kupiansk across the Oskol River. And you can see it's starting to become kind of significant. And what the Russians will want to do is move further south towards Kupiansk. But there's also a theory, and I'll show you later, of how they would also like to maybe link up with those two territories that they have north of the city of Kharkov. The next slide shows you the territory that the Ukrainians managed to take back from the Russians about a day or two ago. Again, this is around the Oskol River. This is they took basically the town of Zaroz Zakhrizove, and it's a pretty decent sized chunk. That to me looks like at least a kilometer long, but several hundred yards, maybe 300 yards from north to south. And now you're going to understand what I mean by probably the first thing that the Russians will want to do. So this slide shows you what I think the overall strategy is. Um, the pocket that the Russians have created for the Ukrainians here has been achieved also by destroying a lot of bridges. But um, but the problem is that I don't know if the Russians have honestly enough manpower, and if this area is as much prioritized as some of the others. But you can see the Oskol River is outlined. The situation of Ukrainian troops forming with a bubble forming around them, and then I have the arrow from the area north of Kupiansk across the Oskol River in the Kursk region. In fact, all this area is actually in the Kursk region, wanting to go down to cut off to Kupiansk. To me, I would think that Kupiansk is really the first order of business. Kursk is a very large city. It would be a lot of fighting to get through. This city is at least as big as Donetsk, and it's proportionally wider as well. So a very advantageous position to be in if you're defending, not so much if you're attacking. And you would want to have control of the Oskol River before you go on to any other business. The next slide is basically what the other theory says is you would want to take care of all this territory by linking up those two plots that the Russians have captured last year with the ongoing advancement by the Russians across the Oskol River, north of Kupiansk. Um, it's possible. I don't know how many troops the Ukrainians have in this region. So far, the Russian gains across the Oskol River north of Kupiansk have been steady. I have not seen any successful counterattack in a way that the Russians have lost territory. Um, the next slide will show you. It's a little. Slide is a little earlier, from a few days further back, and we'll show you the areas that the Russians have captured here. You can see that they've captured several villages, no less than seven, and they have a decent foothold here. Those villages will give them some amount of shelter. There are several forest patches as well, and it will be, if anything, if nothing else, it will be a form of distraction for the Ukrainians, because the number one thing that the Russians, I think, want is the Donetsk Oblast. And now that we've mentioned that, let's go to the Toretsk front. Now, Toretsk was captured a few weeks ago, but there are many outlying suburbs which the Russians this week have been successful in gaining, including, um, really, all of the terracons except one tiny one that is in the gray zone now, as you can see, has have all been captured. In the north, you can see the Russians have captured several fortifications. In the suburb of Krimske, they've captured the last terracon, the last earth mound there, and some of the suburbs. Um, and the Sherebinivka section and the Novospassky section, the Russians have most of those of Sherebinivka and Novospassky. They have a foothold in it. And if you study this map and you look at where this urban agglomeration goes, how it winds, it's winding along a canal. That canal leads to Chasov Yar, and um, unfortunately, I don't have a map, but the Russians have made gains in the last week in Chasov Yar as well. The Ukrainians are still holding out in the apartment high rises next to the industrial complex that the Russians captured a few weeks ago. The next slide will show you just basically the close up of Krymske, the suburb that the Russians captured. It's basically an extension of Toretsk. Okay, and you can see the terracon that they've captured, and then the next slide will show you the trench network north of Toretsk that they've captured, and again in the area of Novospasne, Spassky. Now, this next slide will give you an idea of the direction that the Russians will probably want to take within the Toretsk region. You can see that there's a big water reservoir. You can see that there's some fortifications here, but not that many. They are outside of the urban agglomeration because they are on a high ground. But if you keep following this arrow further north, you're going to get into Chasov Yar. So they'll want a link with Chasov Yar as well, obviously. The next slide shows just the bottom of Chasov Yar. At the right at the top of the frame, you'll see that, and then the big city agglomeration that you see is Konstantinovka. That's a big complex. But what you see to the left of that, okay, is another pocket is forming with Ukrainian troops inside. The Russians will probably, from the left side, from the west side, you see that those ring of that circular ring of fortifications. The Russians will want to capture that and try to force the Ukrainians in this sector. They will. There's many troops here that the Ukrainians have. This area is more of a one-to-one battle as opposed to, say, 1-2 in the Pokrovsk region. So it has a priority, but I don't think it's the priority is the same as the Pokrovsk region proper. The other thing I'll mention about this area is the bottom right hand corner. This salient wasn't there a few months ago, and it's just starting to form. It also marks the halfway point between Toretsk and Pokrovsk. So this is an area that the Russians will want. If once they get it, they'll have all of Donetsk. But again, Konstantinovka will be a very hard nut to crack, even though it is in a low ground. The Russians will want to surround it, just like Velika Novoselovka is also in a low ground. The next slide will show you that region I just mentioned that was in the bottom left-hand pocket. You can see that the Russians have been capturing all kinds of fortifications. They captured the town of Vodyane Druge as well. And the next slide will explain what I'm talking about. You can see that uh, the large circle, this is where a lot of Ukrainian troops are stationed. They will want to move around that, again, following the ring of fortifications and try to trap them there. Then we move to Kursk. And I do have some news from Kursk. So 2 days ago, the Ukrainians they initially tried to blame this on the Russians, but there was a rooming house or some kind of a boarding house or school boarding house um, in a suburb of Sucha. Of course, this is an area that is controlled by the Ukrainians. This is the Russians have never fired on Sucha that if they think that there are Russian citizens there. Moreover, this time the Russians have confirmation of 4 HIMARS missiles being launched and hitting this boarding house. The Ukrainians claim there are at least 100 people under the rubble, which I'm very sure they will not work to rescue. Uh, Mostly old people, but could be children as well and women. So um, you know, once this war is over, I think we're going to discover a lot of horror stories. Because, of course, another horror story is that at least 2 dozen people were recently executed by the Ukrainians. Um, One of the Ukrainian soldiers, Farazenko or something, his name starts with an F. He was interviewed and he basically said, yes, so and so in my troop raped this woman after she was tied up. Then I raped her. And then we killed her by shooting her in the back of the head. Now, there is video footage of it, no less than 5 or 7 people, old people who were hiding in a basement or were escorted into a basement and grenades were thrown there. Them and their dog was like, this is an area where Ukrainians, I'm sure, have been given the go ahead to do as many atrocities as they want. Right?
Yes, and I think that being said, we have to remember one of the first stories about Ukrainian conduct in Kursk that came out within days of the front opening uh, was the massacre of that family in the car.
Yes.
There was the man, the wife, and the 2 children, and they killed them
Yep.
all. That was, I think, August 8th, August 9th, which
Yep.
was like 2 or 3 days after the offensive had started.
Yeah, and and there have been stories. And now the other feature about Kursk is how many foreign fighters are there. Um, from early January, I noticed that I noticed an article on Track America where a Brit, an Aussie, and an American were killed. And then a few weeks later, I think another Canadian and an American were killed. And then just a few days ago, an 18-year-old, an 18-year-old British, like honestly, he's a child, was killed on his first mission. You have to ask yourself, what kind of parents would let an 18-year-old go to a war front? He has really no military experience. Like when you know what, I'm gonna send you a photo because I mean this is a kid. Like this is just well, I'll send you this because this is what happened to his friend.
Oh, that is. I'll get that up. But yeah, and I can only show this for so long because, of course,
Yeah, yeah,
the
yeah.
platform would get a little sensitive about these kind of things. So just for context, that's what this is. And I do want to point out with all of that, with the 18-year-old kid, and I know that we had talked about the story off air, that keep in mind the average age of the Ukrainian soldier on the front line at this point is still early 40s, 41, 42. Uh, Yet you have these foreign volunteers, they're always young men from usually Western nations. Now, Colombia has been an exception in that regard, but this is the British boy that you're referring to. I'll go ahead and put him up. Somebody who, uh, frankly, judging by this picture, and you guys will see what I mean, looks like a kid wearing a costume. Looks like he's, doing some sort of, thing here, like Halloween thing, whatever. This does not look like a professional
James
soldier.
Wilton was his name. James Wilton.
But more and more men are being fed into this meat grinder from various parts of the world. And like I
Yep.
said, History Legends actually did an interesting video on the Colombian mercenaries that I'll bring up now. I recommend everyone go watch that. But as the Ukrainian war effort degrades, as the pressure increases for them to actually start conscripting their own 18-year-olds, we see still from around the world young men throwing away their lives in a fight that ultimately does not concern them, and in fact is on the behalf of people who have nothing but contempt for them. And you can look at some of these mercenaries we've seen since the beginning of this war, and some of these people are just the usual scum that you'd expect. But you are getting more cases like this, and it's bizarre. And honestly, it's just that a lot of these people are, a lot of these young men in particular, victims of a propaganda machine. And
Yep.
I guess it's your country hates you, you live in a broken society, whatever. So why not do something quote unquote meaningful with your life and go fight in a war that is in once again in the service of the same people who destroyed your community, destroyed many of your life prospects that previous generations may have gotten to enjoy, but you didn't. And it's just this same story over and over again, particularly across Europe. You see some cases from Canada and America as well. And I really don't know what else to say beyond that. I doubt anyone listening to the show is inclined to do so, but don't throw away your life on this. And if you know anyone who would even consider doing something, do everything in your power you can to prevent them from doing so. Uh, First mission, and once again, I'll put his picture back up. This is not somebody who has undergone any substantial military training. This is not somebody who is fit for combat. Uh, he doesn't even have. He doesn't even look like he's had the same training that say the 5-day boot camp the conscripts go through on the Ukrainian front line. It just nothing at all.
It's tragic.
It is.
It's tragic. Yeah. It's tragic, and it's only. It does stem from this kind of well nurtured, centuries old hatred of Russians by Anglos. I know the other group that helps them, you know, hate them.
Trust me,
But you
we've been over
cannot,
this a million times on the show. I
but you
don't think it'd be
cannot
justified.
explain 200 years of this. Okay. Like you can't. Like with only one side to blame.
Yes,
It's just it's
this
like
does
so much to answer for it.
remind me of an almost identical story. I think I saw about 3 or 4 months ago. Once again, I think it was a 19-year-old British kid who went into this and said that, uh, he had always cared about quote unquote protecting the little guy, or just something like that. Just
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
some swill that once again these kids are brought up on. They're brought up on this very twisted version of not only their history but particularly the world wars, of this idea of this selfless sacrifice in the service of others who have nothing to even do with you, not even your nation, but just others who have nothing to even do with you at that point. And it's the most honorable thing to lay down your life for that, for liberal principles, just for a
Yeah.
concise term for it. And these kids get talked into it. And look, I can't say I was in that environment, but I can understand what would lead somebody like that because, to return to the scenario I said, you have a society with low prospects, somebody who, if you're a white guy, they simply do not like you. In fact, they have pretty open contempt. And it seems like the only thing you can do right is go fight the quote unquote fascists, go fight the new quote unquote mid century Germans on the front lines. If they lionize those men for what they did 80 years ago, maybe I can recreate those deeds. Well, no, you can't. In fact, those men who did that are now being spit upon by the same people who want to use their deeds as justification for everything they want to do, both at home and abroad. And at the end of the day, your life is forfeit. People are not going to remember you. People are not going to remember the sacrifice. And the question of what the sacrifice even represents is, I don't think, a question that can even be answered.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, what's possessing you to go there, right? Like the truth of the matter is this. Your government, along with the American government, funded a coup in Ukraine to oust a democratically elected president. Not everybody in Ukraine wanted that. And the parts that stood up, uh, were shelled and bombed and had terrorist attacks. They formed militias, right? And they fought back. Those people aren't obligated to go along with whatever your stupid gay government wanted when they created the coup in the first place, right? um but in their heads it's like, well, yeah, it's totally fair. Now you can like the only like all of this part of the history that leads up to the war that we're in now is completely irrelevant. And why is it irrelevant? Well, it's what I said earlier, because it's totally okay for Ukrainians to kill ethnic Russians or other Ukrainians who didn't want the coup. um that's all fine. That's all okay, because they're just Russians, or they're sympathetic to Russians, and it's totally okay to just do coups, right? um
To the point where the
yeah.
Ukrainians can run, in my opinion, what is now effectively one of the most totalitarian states in the world. And I'm not
Right.
saying that as somebody who is infatuated with the principles of democracy. Once again, I think those of you who have been listening to the show long enough know this. But I'm talking about a literal totalitarian state where you can't even breathe the wrong way without the state throwing you in a van and shipping you off to the front line. And uh,
Yeah.
I think we've all seen the videos, and they
I
get
yeah,
worse every
yeah, I
day.
saw I yeah, yeah. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I saw a video today of a guy getting out of the hospital being dragged to the front. The day before, on Sunday, I saw a video of a guy leaving church getting dragged to the front. This is a middle-aged man.
And worse yet, on that point with the church, with the current situation of the Ukrainian government's relationship with the church, they're mobilizing clergy. They've attempted to in the past. Uh,
Yeah.
the monks that they expel from these monasteries, they try to conscript them. We've seen this time again. And look, the dynamics of the war have changed because of the amount of losses, but you look at the early conscription drives, it's in the areas of the east. It was in the parts of Kherson still controlled by the Ukrainians. It was in Kharkiv. It was in Dnipropetrovsk, the place where the Russian speakers live. And alternatively, they were also in Zakarpattia and I think it's Chernovitsi, places
Hmm.
with Romanians and Hungarians.
Right.
And you'll notice that even still, now the conscription drive, because of how desperate they gotten, are starting to go into places like Lvov and Rovno
Yes.
and Ternopil. These places that are the hubs of, say, proper ethnic Ukrainians. What one would think of when, or at least what they would portray as the idea of
And
a
and
Ukraine.
also and also the areas that support Bandera the most.
Yes, certainly.
But
And
they won't conscript from there. You know, that's bad.
no, no. And they spent 2 years putting that off, and only reluctantly are they now doing that. And look, frankly, most of the men from those areas who wanted to fight in this war were the ones who have been fighting in this war since 2014. That's just the way it
Yes.
is. Or,
Yes.
at whatever point they were old enough to join in on the latent fight in the East, because these are the ideological radicals. These are the guys who, look, I detest what they stand for, but they were the ones who signed up first and got put in Krinky only to get slaughtered. And that's what Ukraine did with its most devoted fighters. And that's the state that they died for.
Yeah.
And I don't know what more you can say. And of course, I know the law's been up in the air with the lowering of the conscription age, with pretty severe pressure from the U.S. and to a lesser extent the other Western powers in order to go through with this, in order to secure aid, and that's been probably the biggest, one of the biggest contentions I have with Trump so far is the fact that he's so insistent on something like that. But once again, the people who want to worship at the feet of Bandera, who want to form this cult of personality around him, and view that Ukraine, led by a Jewish comedian named Zelensky, is somehow the successor state to that. And sure, they'll give you all the justification, well, like, well, we only had to be in a temporary alliance, and then we're going to build based Ukraine afterwards, or whatever nonsense they tell you. But once again, this is the state, this is the nation that they sign up to die for, to fight and die for, and this is how they treat them. And like I said, you can think these guys are testable, but at the end of the day, it's I mean, yes, they do fall on their own swords. Many of them. I'm not talking about the guys thrown in the back of the vans. Just to be crystal clear
Yeah.
about that. But yeah, a lot of these people who are actually ideologically motivated and actually do live up to those principles um, fall on their own swords, and they die for a country that, once again, if this war ended even the slightest bit favorably for Ukraine, Zelensky would put all these people in jail tomorrow, along with all the pro-Russian elements in the country.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I think it's an excellent point. So we're nearly done. The next slide is Velika Novoselovka has Velika Novoselka. I keep giving it a kind of a South Slavic twist to it. Has finally fallen. It fell last week, about 6 or 7 days ago, and you can see where it's situated. There at the bottom is Velika Novoselka, and at the top, that other circle is Pokrovsk. And the next slide shows you basically some territories that the Russians, as a buffer, took north of the town. Now, Velika Novoselka is it, it, it has at least three rivers that go through it, and I was right that it didn't have any industry there, but it did have some low high rises, like 5-story buildings, more than I thought. And again, History Legends did a very good video on the fighting there, and sadly, you know, we saw a lot of this. We saw the Ukrainians, of course, mass execution of Russian soldiers who had surrendered, especially in 2022 and 2023. But you're starting to see the Russians doing this more now. And I shared a video that was the Ukrainians put it back out, I think, at the end of January, but it was actually from October of last year, and it belonged in a file. The data linked to the JPEG or the video file had it said it belonged in a folder called Liman. In that case, that might be back in 2022, but it was supposed to have happened in Kursk. So maybe the person who had the video, but in any case, it first appeared in October, and so they were trying to pass it off as new summary killings by the Russian soldiers. But and of course, no one here on the war report, we don't approve either side doing this,
No, no.
obviously. And in the capture of Novoselka, the Russians executed two groups of Ukrainians, first five, and then a couple more. And I don't know. Like, I mean, sometimes in these videos, these aren't the because of course what they do, okay, what they do that is in the Ukrainians when they set up these pockets, and they wait. It's there to slow down the Russians as much as possible, right? And they'll make an attempt to break them out, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But usually, the troops like that belong to the 110th. They are going to be abandoned, and of course, there's an incredible video of the members of the 110th. If you remember, these are the guys who were stuck in Avdiivka last year, and uh yes, Azov Battalion came and rescued some, but those are further north towards the industrial area. This is not in the south, near the hunter's cabin and in the forested area. And estimates were something like between 800 to 900 soldiers of the Ukrainians were captured. Uh, Now, in this video, what he's saying is, unlike the Kurakovo front from a month ago, uh, these guys weren't rescued. And there's a video of these 5 or 6 guys holed up in a blown out building, and very angry. Like, you can see that they know their fate. They asked to be rescued by some of the elite battalions, and um, the elite battalion said, you know, your destiny, you've been left to destiny, to fate. Meaning, like, we're not bringing you on board. Uh, I don't know. There's not enough vehicles or whatever. A lot of these guys try to escape on foot. About 50% of them apparently were killed. Um, I'm trying to find you because I have a good graphic of this that'll explain which brigades, or rather battalions, were involved in the siege of. Oh well, here it is. So you can see that the guy in the prancing black horse. That's the Velika Novoselovka. The ones in the purple and gold, those are the president's troops, the president's brigade. Of course, they were saved, and then the other one, I forget their name, and it's too blurry for me to read it, but those two escaped. Um, as you can see, the 110th was way at the bottom, and uh, Neskuchny. Uh, this is one of the early successes of the Ukrainians back in the summer of 2023, when they took Neskuchny from the Russians. But none of those guys made it out. Anyways, I don't want to belabor the point. The next slide I'm going to show you is essentially what happened. The Russians really couldn't attack from the left or the right. They had to go in from the bottom, because particularly the green arrows demonstrate where there was no river to obstruct them. So um, that was the course of the attack. And anyways, another just literally another sad, bloody chapter of this war.
Oh,
And
great.
that's all I have for the frontline use.
And with that being said, I'll focus on Velika Novoselka and the situation there. A repeat of Avdiivka in many ways, with how the fall of the settlement was handled. And in many ways, the Ukrainians are in a situation where they can either hold out and fight to the bitter end, and we see the result of that many, many times, or they could allow for surrenders, which I know that it's been very contentious. In fact, they've actually threatened legal action over it at times, which would only further degrade the morale of the AFU, which is already seeing massive desertions. Or they could retreat and give up further and further territory. But point being is, this is very clearly a side that is not winning this war. This is very clearly a side that is quite openly losing this war. And I think these past couple of weeks, ever since Trump's taken office, when it comes to the question of Ukraine on the global stage and the question of Ukraine as a proxy conflict, it's been a roller coaster. Because,
Hmm. Hmm.
of course, at first there was the foreign aid moratorium that excluded Ukraine. There was an exception made to the exception where Ukraine would be excluded again. And then now you have Rubio coming out and saying that military aid to Ukraine would resume. And I'll get into the details in that of just a moment here. But you've had talks and negotiations, possibility of negotiations. Trump teasing the issue back and forth. And as I mentioned before, him and his team have actually been pretty big advocates of lowering the conscription age, and that was one of the conditions that they wanted to meet in order for peace negotiations to begin. Uh, while none of these have ever taken into consideration the demands that Russia has, in which case there needs to be a concession that Ukraine will not be in NATO. There needs to be fresh elections held because Zelensky, according to Ukraine's own constitution, according to the Russians, is not legitimately in power, and he either needs to win another term or leave office. And also the recognition of the territories which they had the referenda in late 2022. And without those conditions, the Russians are simply not open to negotiations. However, with to return back to Rubio announcing the unfreezing of aid, the agreement, at least what Trump was saying, that the tentative agreement that was reached between the United States and Ukraine is that Ukraine will cede mineral resources to the United States in exchange for military aid. And you know where we actually first heard this point? I was pointing this to you off air. But that was in an interview. We read it on air with Arestovich back in January 2024, where his proposal in order to sweeten the pot for the U.S. to provide more aid to Ukraine was promising payouts in natural resources. And you might think that's a
Mm.
like yes, it's laughable when you actually consider it. You might think that's reasonable on the surface of it, but there's one
It's not. It's
no, it's not. There's one glaring problem with that plan. I'll give you guys 5 seconds to guess.
yes, yes, yes.
Okay, for those of you now that your 5 seconds is up who haven't come to the conclusion, the vast majority of mineral deposits are in the Russian occupied territories. And that is the crux of this. They are not You're not going to get those minerals back. And unless this is somebody playing on Trump's ignorance of say the situation in Ukraine, very well could be because I don't expect Trump to have a great in-depth geopolitical understanding of Ukraine and its mineral resources or its geography. But unless it's not that, if Trump truly does understand this, that would imply a counteroffensive that would make the 2022 counteroffensive look like child's play in order
Mm.
to not only take back but secure these areas with the minerals. Once again, we're talking mostly in the Donbass area, and that's why it has always been the heart of industry in Ukraine, whether it was under the Russian Empire, whether it was under the Soviet Union, whether it was under modern Ukraine. That heart of the industrial economy, because that is where the natural resources are extracted. So the plan makes no sense. I think in many ways it's an excuse so Trump can say, hey, at least we're getting something out of it to people who are not going to bother looking further into the issue. And it very well could be because, as we had said many times before, while there may be some progress, we're not going to rule it out entirely. Trump's hands are tied on a number of issues, Ukraine being one of them, where it does seem that the status quo will prevail. And I've brought this point up many times. I do think it bears repeating once again. We are left with three options for the fate of Ukraine, and that is the West, particularly led by the United States, can keep climbing the escalation ladder until either Russia collapses or this explodes into a continental, if not world war. That's option one. Option two is continue with the status quo, where the Russians will slowly but surely continue to degrade the military capabilities of Ukraine to the point where they probably drive it into collapse and are left dictating terms of their own. Or three, the collective West can cut its losses and enter into serious negotiations with the Russians and frankly probably the Chinese at this point as well, with how the dynamics of this conflict have grown and how much effort would be needed to be taken in order to end this conflict on a diplomatic note. And those are the only three options as to what's going to happen to Ukraine. You can gamble on the escalation ladder, you can leave it all to Russia, or you can try to salvage. You can try to save some face, which it looks like nobody's interested in the option of saving some face because they know that they're probably going to lick their wounds afterwards. It's not going to look good. But it also makes you wonder: is a complete collapse of Ukraine, where the Russians dictate terms of victory, going to look any better, or are they sincerely delusional enough to keep climbing the escalation ladder in hopes that Russia's economy will finally overheat and Putin will be left to pick up the pieces? Uh, I I
I mean,
cannot
I
make.
think the Russians could easily keep going for another year or two.
Oh, absolutely, and I think at this point that's all they would need, and that even if aid is going to continue to Ukraine, if Trump continues with his current optics, let's just say, it is going to continue to degrade the morale of both Ukraine and also the European sponsor of Ukraine. It's going to create a rift in maybe not the material support for Ukraine, but the moral support for Ukraine, which I do not think is going to bode well in the front lines. Front lines where the men are already demoralized as can be. In which case, I do think if the Russians are able to push for another year, they can probably collapse the situation. Now, to return to your point from earlier, I don't think the Russians are going to make a drive for the Dnieper simply because it's not necessary. And I mean, they don't have the resources in place. We've seen that. They're not building up the kind of army that you would expect for them to launch a quote unquote big arrow offensive, which we've talked about big arrow offensives. I don't really think they're
Yeah.
on the table at this point.
And if I could just
Please do.
briefly, very briefly interrupt. The problem with big arrow offensives in the age of drone warfare and satellite real-time information sharing is that it needs enormous concentration of forces. Enormous concentration of forces for MLRS units are great. Both sides have very good MLRS systems, like the HIMARS, for instance, or the Urugan, or any of the other ones. And so, no, there was you've seen how many times the Russians have been caught doing this, right? Well, there was another case now for the Ukrainians where there was this estimated like 27 were killed, right? So it doesn't work, and it can't work unless you have a way of suppressing your opponent, and Russia does not have a way of suppressing 12 different countries who are flying spy craft like AWACS planes from the bottom of the Black Sea all the way to St. Petersburg 24/7 for 3 years, right?
Yes, the
No, this doesn't even include private and government satellites, right?
like Starlink, Elon
Like
Musk.
Starlink, right? Right. It doesn't even include that, right? So the problem with big arrow offensives is you can't have a concentration of forces without being seen first. So this is what you're stuck with. That's the reality. That young man Wilton, who was killed, the way he was killed was Russian drone operators were hurting 3 or 4 of his comrades, and they were hurting them in a way so they could group them, and then the drone would dive on them. It's really sick. And you saw like that guy, he survived, but Wilton and the other guy did not survive, right? And that was his first mission. And of course, cynically, the Ukrainians send this. Imagine, like, okay, I mentioned the parents, but what about the Ukrainians? They're looking at this boy. I mean, he's small too. He's not like a mature 18-year-old. And they think like, yeah, we'll send him. Like, how desperate do you have to be? You know you're losing when you're thinking, yeah, you know what? Let's send the foreigners, right? That, and it's kind of hilarious because it reminds me of that speech that Zelensky gave, where he said, "Oh, we would have 100,000 troops, maybe 200,000 NATO troops, and they wouldn't be living in the city. They would be going on the front to help us." Yes, of course. What do you mean? Yes, of course. Like, who do you think you are? Oh yeah, they're gonna. They should. All I'm saying is there's many areas where there's not much going on, like Kherson. That's a perfect place. Like, I'm not trying to advocate for how to defeat Russia. Everybody who knows this show, we are sympathetic to Russia. We've make no bones about that. We don't apologize for it. But what I'm saying is you would send this boy to Kherson or somewhere in Zaporozhye, right? You wouldn't send him to Kursk
And the proposal for
or Pokrovsk. Well, he didn't go. I mean, it was in Kursk, but those are the two areas where there's so much carnage. Why would you send him there? Like, you have to be desperate.
and you know you're right. I'm glad you brought that up because whenever the question of NATO peacekeepers got brought up, whether by Macron or Stammer or whatever, the proposal always was, and Zelensky was never satisfied with this, is that they would take over securing the Ukrainian Belarusian border, where you have tens of thousands of inactive Ukrainian troops just there to hold the line in case another front opens in Belarus. And
Yeah.
that was, and understandably so, not that I support it, but understandably so, that was the proposal of the West, that was the proposal of NATO, that we'll hold this line, we'll make sure nothing goes wrong here, so you can actually fight the war. But that was rejected every time. Send them to the slow fronts? No. The foreign mercenaries, they have to march right into the line of fire. The foreign troops, the quote unquote peacekeepers, have to be the ones fighting the war somehow. That's what they've
Mm-hmm.
always gone for. That's what Zelensky thinks of you. That's what Zelensky thinks of your countrymen. And I suppose, with that being said, one last thing I'll cover before I get into the U.S. aid thing is Zelensky's recent tantrum with Piers Morgan, talking about how Ukraine should have never given up the nukes. He keeps insisting on this issue.
This is so
Well,
stupid.
yes, and I'm sure I don't need to tell anyone here that after the fall of the Soviet Union, the launch codes, the mechanism to use those nukes, never left Moscow. After the Soviet Union fell, the Russian Federation inherited that stockpile. So, with the nukes in Kazakhstan, with the nukes in Belarus, Ukraine, wherever they may be in the former Soviet Union, those were Russian nukes. The Russian state had inherited that. And look, while the Russian Federation inherited the Soviet Union's place on the Security Council, its nuclear arsenal, the bulk of its military, they also inherited its debts and all the other burdens that came with being the country responsible for picking up the pieces of the Soviet Union. So if Ukraine wants to shoulder the debts of, say, the former Soviet Union, sure, they can keep the nukes, but nobody was ever going to make that deal. Nobody was ever going to accept that. Uh, but as it stood, those were always Russian nukes on Ukrainian and Kazakh soil, in which it was actually in the best interest of Ukraine and Kazakhstan to get those nukes out of their country. And I'm sure the people who feed him these lines know exactly what they're doing and know exactly what the facts are behind the situation. Zelensky might not. I don't think he's the brightest, to the shock of anyone. But they do keep peddling this line, and it does make me think that I don't think it's going to happen. I don't think he's going to get it, but he does seem to be, at this point, implicitly, and it will probably become explicit at some point, begging for some sort of nuclear deterrence with Ukraine. Whether that be launch codes in the hands of Kiev, or whether that be some foreign backer putting him under the security umbrella. Either way, he seems adamant on the issue that Ukraine be protected by a nuclear umbrella, which, frankly, even with how escalatory the West is, I do not think is going to happen, especially at this stage in the war. But he keeps relitigating this issue over and over and over again. But I suppose, with that being said, one good piece of news to come out of Ukraine is with the initial suspension and then abolition of U.S. aid, which is, of course, is a program the U.S. government funds where all the money conspicuously goes to the non-governmental organizations, the NGOs, receiving money directly from the U.S. state. So wrap your head around that one. Ukrainian independent media, whether that be the Kiev Post or Ukrainska Pravda or any of these outlets, have just been begging for donations. And they have been on their knees and just wanting you, the generous reader, to support the free and independent media of Ukraine after its foreign tax dollars got cut off. And this has not only happened in Ukraine, but we've seen this in Hungary in particular as well, but across Europe. And then probably the biggest shock of all that I saw today is now Politico, a domestic U.S. news outlet, is begging for donations. So I know we haven't talked about it much on the show because it's the U.S. avenues to fund color revolutions and soft power movements are many. U.S. aid has been one of the primary drivers of that, but it's never been a topic that I felt that we've had to address. But now that that's abolished, I do think it's worth bringing up because, in many ways, the soft power apparatus of the American state, and it's far from the only one, but it has defunded one of its most valuable tools, which is one thing I will give Trump an immense amount of credit for at this point. Now, I'll have my harsher criticisms later in the show, especially once we get into some Middle Eastern issues. But I, at this point, sure, you have the situation in Ukraine, but probably the best outcome of the U.S. aid situation is that we're already seeing the color revolution protests taking place in Georgia, Slovakia, and to a lesser extent Serbia, because the protests going on in Serbia do have a bit of a different character to it. I'm not saying that there's no, of course, U.S. and EU involvement. Of course there is, but they do have a slightly different character to them that I may or may not get into depending on time here. But we've seen particularly the protest movements in Serbia and Georgia evaporate overnight after these announcements that the funds have been cut off. It was initially a 90-day moratorium, and while, of course, I doubt this is the end of the color revolution apparatus, far from, what we have seen is a major stymieing of American State Department operations that are actually in progress, in which case they probably will have to cut some of these projects loose. And while in many of them probably will return in the future, while there probably will be a reorganization, a lot of people have gotten breathing room. What looked like the potential for a color revolution in Hungary a few months ago, it looks like in large part, I'm not saying entirely, but in large part, that's been snuffed out. Fico's position, while it never looked bad, looks suddenly much better. In Georgia, which is probably the most contentious of them all, it's looking great in Georgia now that they have this pressure off their back. And like I said, this isn't
And
going to
they
be.
just admitted today that 47 or 45 million dollars were used just in the most recent election. Like it's just like USA aid, which stands for there's no aid, it's U.S. Agency of International Development, something like that.
Yeah, U.S.
And
grids, as
if
I
I'm
prefer to call it.
yes, and if I'm not mistaken, if now I know Kennedy started this agency, but here there's an ironic twist. Um, someone correct me if I'm wrong. I might have this agency mixed up with an agency that was kind of like a forerunner or related to it. But remember, Lee Harvey Oswald stayed with, well, his wife was staying with the Payne family, Ruth and I believe Mark Payne. Ruth Payne's, no, Ruth Payne's husband had a brother who worked for USA Aid, and she had a sister that worked as a psychologist at the CIA offices in Virginia. I just think that's kind of interesting. And anyhow, so yeah, USA Aid or USA AIDS, it's I mean 50 like the entire intelligence apparatus. Think of all the different intelligence agencies that the US has. They get 72 billion, right? USA Aid received $50 billion a year. That's what its budget was. It was literally more than the CIA. I mean, it is the CIA, but it's a CIA that was reformatted after the end of Vietnam.
Yes, I'm glad you brought that up. And one thing I will add, because I know I focus particularly on the former Eastern Bloc and former Soviet Union, let's not forget that the NGOs played a part in the overthrow of the Assad government. They played a
Yep.
part in facilitating mass migration both in Europe and North America. They play a part in pushing uh, the all the bizarre protest movements in Russia, which yes is former Soviet Union, but Putin a number of years ago denounced U.S. aid, saying that yes, this is a front for color revolutions. Um, they're involved, of course, in shady activity in Africa and the Middle East. Pretty much anywhere the American Empire is, they were laundering funds and directing them to whatever local organization was in line with the U.S. State Department's goal at that time. Operational in
Hmm.
East Asia as well. That's needless to say. But like I said, even for those of you who, and I doubt if you're listening to this program you fall in that category, but even for people who aren't even necessarily concerned about the international stage, but just more home issues, uh, just know that yes, USA was involved in a lot of the mass migration movements and other organizations involved in mass migration movements. You already have a lot of these groups in the United States that were facilitating this. Also, once again, running around begging for donations in light of losing their foreign aid, or I suppose in this case it would be government aid from a domestic source. But you get the point. And I don't, like I said, this is not a light at the end of the tunnel. This is not. We're not home free because the American empire has entire toolbox full of regime change tools and full of
Hmm.
tools it can use on its domestic population. I do not want
Yeah,
to
yeah.
downplay that. But what this does signify is in my opinion, a radical restructuring. Now, whether this is just moved under the auspices of, say, the State Department as a whole, at that point, it does make things a lot more streamlined where if you do see the money flowing to these organizations, you're seeing it come from the State Department and not USAID. You're seeing it come directly from the U.S. government. So it does make things look a bit more uh, obvious. And I do think that does stop some of the more excessive elements because at this point, I don't want to get off too far off tangent. What I gather from Trump at this point, especially with the push for Greenland, the Panama Canal, and some of the mild skepticism of foreign intervention that we've seen so far in his second term, is that cutting off the color revolution apparatus is part of a larger strategy of, once again, uh, fortifying the home island, as it were.
Right. As
Where,
we said, there's a retraction.
yes,
It may look like an expansion. It may look like that, but it's probably more of a retraction, right? Like Trump, no, notice, I mean, he made a fool out of himself today with Netanyahu, but especially pulling out a chair for Netanyahu to sit down. Did you see that? Oh my God! But let me just put into perspective. And again, forgive me for interrupting, but
no, please go on.
Netanyahu, as Trump said that there'll be definitely sanctions against Europe. Okay, now we don't know if he's going to bluff. He's just doing because, of course, it looked like it was a bluff against the Mexicans and the Canadians, or he's going to rather set up a pattern where every time he doesn't get what he wants, he's going to threaten tariffs.
Yes, and this is just a more extreme version of what he did during his first term. So this is not necessarily new
Yes,
territory.
correct. Now, he said that Britain probably has nothing to worry about. Well, I'll tell you which country will never have to worry about it, and that's Israel. So Britain will probably not have to worry about it. Europe will. Israel never. That tells you like what the future home island will probably be like. And today he announced that he intends for the Gaza Strip to be American property.
Ah, yes. I do want to get into that later. So
Yes.
if
Okay.
you
You go on.
yeah,
You
if
go
you
on. I've done
please
enough
yeah,
damage.
please put a bookmark in that because I do want to get into the Middle Eastern stuff a little bit later from here. But with what we see, and I'm glad you brought that up, especially with the question of tariffs and with the question of Trump's foreign policy, where there's the fortification of the home island, the fortification of, let's just say, North America in particular, where he is putting the screws down on Canada and Mexico to bring them even more in line, of course, with Washington's goals. The desire for Greenland, which it looks like at this point is going to be an expansion of military bases. We'll see if we actually get. What I think is the furthest the Greenland situation can go is an independence referendum in favor of independence, which, of course, would also lead to further integration of the United States because there'd simply be no other options. But with the all of this happening, with the question of the tariffs, with the cutting of U.S. aid, and some of the more radical restructuring within the domestic United States, with a lot of Trump's executive orders, both the good and the bad, and also the presence of Elon Musk in the so-called Department of Government Efficiency. What I do think we're seeing happening is an attempt at a major course correction because they've seen the fact that Russia, after just shy of 3 years of war, is not only still standing, but far more prosperous than it was beforehand. China continues to ascend. India also, despite its problems, it still continues to be a major player in the world that is aligned with Russia and China. The Iranians are shaken but not broken. Same with their proxy organizations, say Hezbollah, Hamas. Assad being the exception. Assad is out of power. The Houthis are certainly still a force to be reckoned with. But as it stands, all of America's rivals are growing stronger while the American empire was continuing to degrade itself. So what it looks like is finally happening, and I do think that there was some attempt to pursue this course during Trump's first term, was a trimming of the fat, whether that be in terms of domestic policy, whether that be in terms of foreign policy, where they are willing to do away with some of the excesses of the empire if it means they can fortify themselves for the course of, I don't know, the next several decades, just to put a rough time frame on it, so that America can still be a competitive power in the world. And this was, I mean, even Rubio's statements in the interview that I gave was bizarre, saying that a unipolar world is the exception, and that the fact that we're turning to a multipolar world, he used those words,
Yes, he
words that
did.
you never thought you would hear outside of the commentary circles on online. Uh,
Especially from him.
yeah, especially from him. But there has been an admission, even from somebody like him, who I think is probably the most prominent neocon, especially now that he's in the State Department. It is an admission that we are looking at a radical restructuring, to use the phrase once again, of the world right now, where the people who championed American hegemony, American unipolarity, are realizing that that's simply not the case. That we had that time in the sun, we had our good 10, 15 years of it, but now we need to play as an actual player on the, to borrow Brzezinski's term, grand chessboard, and realize what we're actually up against. And like I said, while some of these changes do look positive, and while indeed some of them probably will be positive if played right, this is not a rejection of many of the things that we would like to see go. It is simply them realizing pragmatically they have to let go of certain excesses in order to secure the core of the system. This is not a complete overhaul, this is simply a reform. It may be a large reform, it may be a sweeping reform, but it is not a fundamental rejection of the principles of, let's just say, the past 100, 150 years, even 200 years that that people listening to this program that you and I would like to see. I know that a lot of people want to get their hopes up, and I think I've been guilty of this at times. I think we all have. But what you do have to realize, while there will be some good that can come out of this, and while you should do everything in your power to make sure these things are steered in the right direction, not that I think any of us have too significant of influence over it, the fact as it stands is that a lot of this is probably going to be used in order to once again secure the system so it can continue to uh, propagate the empire further down the road.
Yeah.
This is just a simple cutting of losses, and which is why I somewhat do expect to see Ukraine maybe be cut off. Even though with that you could make the argument that we're going to continue this low level support of Ukraine in order to weaken Russia, keep at least that's their logic. That's not what I think will happen. But we can do the re-entrenchment. We can give a little bit to Ukraine so they can erode the Russians, so we can knock them down a few pegs while we focus on restructuring ourselves. And like I said, we'll see how all of that plays out. And you do see, even with the tariffs, Trump has taken. Uh, I guess he wants to be tough, but he also wants to be um, cordial with the Chinese at the same time. It's this very much this double think, and there's a lesser extent with that with Russia. I would say he's been more hawkish on the Russia question, and then even Iran, I think he's been completely schizophrenic on because, of course, and I'll get into the Middle East stuff in a moment here, but I'll just give this as a primer. Where he's saying, "Oh, if you try to retaliate against me for the Soleimani assassination, we're not going to spare you." But also, I would like to meet with Pezeshkian. I'd like to discuss some, pertinent issues.
Yeah, completely schizophrenic. And he says, if, if Iran tries to kill me, it's gonna be hell to pay. So he's such a clown, my God.
Yeah, it's a. You better not touch me. But also, would you like to come over and visit Mar-a-Lago and we can discuss some new treaties? It's like it.
Like literally projection.
Yeah, it's
They would not try to assassinate him.
no, no.
They would try to assassinate them, though. Um,
And we've seen that.
yeah,
We've seen how that plays out. And I suppose that being said, since I've primed the pump, we can jump right in the Middle East where Trump had
sure.
his meeting with Netanyahu visiting Washington. Now, I know that Trump and Netanyahu, we've been talking about their dynamic for the past few months, just days before he was put in office on Truth Social, which is the source for all things Trump. He did share that video of Jeffrey Sachs turning into Netanyahu and his destruction across the region. In which case, what I had initially thought with that, and I still think there might be some elements to this, I'll get into this further, is that of course Trump was not going to Trump was never going to stab Israel in the back. That was just not going to happen. But I did think there was a possibility Trump could stab Netanyahu in the back in coordination with the domestic opponent in order to wipe the slate clean and have the situation in the Middle East reset itself, where somebody much more amenable to Trump is in power in the Middle East. While, of course, America still is ensnared by its greatest ally, there is a little bit more of a transactional side to the relationship with somebody that Trump gets along with better. And that very well could be what is in store. I think time will tell. But Trump and Netanyahu had I would say, a meeting that looked like it could have been out of Trump's first term, where they went in and they shook the hands. Of course, Trump pulled out the chair for him. He said, and we went over the statements on Iran. But as you were getting into earlier, and I think we can finally dive right into
Hmm.
this, is that America is now responsible for the Gaza Strip because we negotiated the ceasefire.
And this is Netanyahu's idea, by the way,
Of course it was. Of course it was.
right? Did you see the way Netanyahu was constantly grinning as Trump was talking, especially when he brought up October 7th? And then Netanyahu would survey the room like with a smile on his face, like, yeah, yeah, he's doing it. He must have been doing that for some of the people in his entourage.
Let me just say,
Uh,
if you drew a picture of Netanyahu like that, you would probably be put on some watch lists, or maybe not watch lists, but let's just say some hit pieces would be written about you.
yeah, yeah. I mean, because Trump is signing some, he's getting some very important anti-Semitic laws getting drafted. What a guy. Um, yeah. So
It's okay. Neither of us are in college, so we can say whatever we want about certain nations and certain peoples in the Middle East. But it is funny. He's like pushing this anti-Semitism task force to deal particularly with the Department of Education, while also wanting to abolish the Department of Education. I can't wrap my head around it.
yeah. Now, there's several ways to look at this, right? So Trump is using the media as a kind of transparency rather than a transparent media. Let me explain. Before Netanyahu came, he basically said, I don't want to attack Iran. You nothing I can do about I've tried, but Egypt and Jordan are not going to take the Palestinians, right? Now, the reason he said this is so that both Jordan and Egypt cannot back away from their statements, and that Netanyahu gets the message that Trump has already tried, and negotiations on Netanyahu's part will be fruitless. Okay, but then he talks about how Gaza will be controlled by the U.S., right? And he talked about the destruction in Gaza as if it was like the forest fires in L.A. We don't know how all this destruction. It's just terrible. Like it was an act of nature. Like it wasn't the U.S. giving billions of dollars in arms to do this, to literally fund war criminals. And um, on the one hand, the day before Netanyahu lands in the U.S., Saudi Arabia and four other Arab Gulf states all say,
Saudi
uh,
Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, the Emirates,
yes,
and Saudi Arabia.
yes, all of them say They are not. Thank you. They are not in favor. We cannot have normalization until like the issue with the Palestinians is solved, and that does not mean you're going to move them even more millions into Egypt and Jordan.
Well, I don't think it's controversial to say, or nor do I think it is particularly original to say that a mass influx of Palestinians in both Egypt and Jordan would mean the end of Sisi and would mean the end of the Hashemite monarchy in Jordan.
It could, it could, it very well could. It could mean that, but as I said earlier, you also see America prioritizing. Right now, USA aid, um, that and NED, the National Endowment for Democracy. Of course, both these organizations were not technically under the government auspices, even though they received their funding through CIA channels.
Yes, of course,
But
there was always the plausible deniability.
yes, that's right. Now, with them gone, of course, I mean, there'll probably be a little bit more transparency. I say a little, and I mean just a little bit more. It could mean that that 50 billion he wants to use for something else. Now, it could be that he wants to fund Ukraine more, or it could be that he wants to secure Israel better. I don't know how much of it will be for America itself, but he did already sign $1 billion of new arms for Israel.
Yes, even though the one thing I will say is I don't even think it's necessarily out of great concern on a personal level, but the narrative both among the American people and the elite have shifted so much where there does have to at least be some temporary solution to the immigration crisis. So we
Yeah.
hopefully we'll see something of that there, but it's become an issue that's too big to ignore at least. So there's something with that. But yes, I was just about to bring up that they did advance the arm package to Israel once again, $1 billion worth of arms to Israel. But the money from USAID, I would imagine, would probably be rolled into more hard power uses or more explicit expressions of American
Of the
power,
CIA. Yeah.
and that the model, the post-Vietnam model of the color revolution, of the win the hearts and minds, and the laundering regime change through various organizations, it does seem like that era is over. And this does come after, to return to the issue,
In a way,
it,
it's because America squandered its reputation.
yes, and this does come after a series of color revolutions with diminishing returns, as we've discussed many times, where the Maidan was the big one, and they'd never been able to top that. And they tried in Belarus. They somewhat succeeded in Moldova. They tried in Georgia. They somewhat succeeded in Armenia. But point being is they never got the kind. They never got Russia. Is the point, which was the crowning achievement of the Color Revolution. They never got it. So the program had to be disbanded after a certain point.
Right, right. Yeah, that's very succinctly put.
But going back to the question of Gaza, because Trump, well, it was never specified whether the U.S. taking control over it would be under the auspices of the military, under the auspices of the State
As
Department.
far as I know,
No,
there's contractors there.
that does make sense. But
Remember, Biden had American elite forces with the IDF.
yes, and I remember Biden's entire plan was to build the quote unquote humanitarian ports in Gaza
Yeah,
as well. So I imagine in many ways it is a retooling of that plan. But Trump,
yeah.
which isn't shocking at all, was talking about this like it was a real estate deal. We're going to bulldoze everything. We're going to start anew. We're going to rebuild everything fresh, and it's
We're
going
going
to
to
be,
create jobs.
yeah, we're going to create jobs for the people there. Yet he's also talking about the expulsion of the people there. So,
Yeah, he's ethnically cleansing them after after genociding them.
yeah, but then also conceding the issue because the Arab states won't cooperate, and what leverage does he have over the Arabs at this point? To the point, I mean, look, Saudi
He's still
Arabia,
trying to get the Saudis to
yeah,
lower the oil
yeah,
prices,
Saudi
which they're
Arabia
not going to do.
wouldn't even answer Biden's phone calls. They might be a little more coy with Trump, but they're not going to cave into his demands. This isn't his first term, and really, I think the only way something like that could happen is and maybe this is why we're seeing more open towards diplomacy with Iran, is that if the U.S. can break Iran either through military or non-military means, Saudi Arabia's confidence in, say, BRICS or the new growing power bloc is going to be shaken. In which case, they might be a little more acquiescent to American demands. That and the entirety of the Gulf states. But so long as China is able, BRICS, and I would say China in particular in this case, is able to facilitate the reconciliation of Saudi Arabia and Iran, and also the further economic development of both countries, you're not going to get a Saudi Arabia that plays ball with the U.S. like it did in previous decades. It's just not going to happen. And particularly on the Israel issue, I'm not sure how true this is, but from my understanding of Saudi law, because Mohammed bin Salman is only the crown prince and he's acting as regent for his father, who has been in a coma for a number of years
Several
now.
years.
Yeah, King
Yeah.
Salman. Even as regent, he does not have the authority to revoke royal decree, which King Salman had, as there can be no recognition of Israel without a coherent two-state solution. Like I said, I don't know how true that is, but at this point, it does seem like the Saudis' hands are tied on that issue. And with that being said, Mohammed bin Salman, he is a slimy character. I wouldn't trust him as far as I could throw him, but
Right.
he he's very pragmatic. He's not going to suddenly acquiesce to American demands because Trump sweetened the pot enough. He knows where he stands. Okay? He knows Saudi Arabia's future. He knows what he has to do in order to stay a dynamic player on the world stage. Because, like I said, you don't have to like him, but he is arguably a more competent Erdogan in that sense, where he really does know how to play all
Yeah.
actors in any given conflict. And I would say he's much better at it too.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with that. Now, it Saudi Arabia it's an interesting case because, of course, Saudi Arabia has several U.S. bases, right? And in a way, when you have U.S. bases, you basically have given up your sovereignty. And the thing that the Saudis seem to be able to do now, they still are able to do some kind of wiggle room, and it wouldn't be the case if had it not been for the fact that they have the two holiest sites in Islam, Mecca and Medina, and the kind of influence that they wield throughout the Sunni world. Had it not been for that, they would be just no different than, I don't know, Qatar or whatever. Um,
Just an oil-rich sheikdom, but it has far more influence
yes,
than, say, its neighbors.
right. And this is what really gives them that kind of leverage in the region that defies normally what we think of, let's say, European countries, Italy, uh, Romania, Greece, all of them have American nuclear silos, Britain too, and it's the Americans who have the codes to those. They decide when to fire them, not those countries. So those countries aren't sovereign countries by any means. And
And keep in mind, even Turkey hosts U.S. nukes.
does it?
I think it still does, even after everything. It still does. At least, okay,
Aiming
maybe
at Interlink?
I do think what it is that it hosts U.S. nuclear capable aircraft, not necessarily missiles.
Right, right. So uh, I think now if Trump is advertising that he's going to take over Gaza, or to put it more succinctly, that he's going to work for Netanyahu and put troops on Israel's behest in Gaza, like a fake America acting again as a fake neutral in this struggle. Um, that would cause some pause for the Arab world, for the Arab Sunni world. Now, is that enough to make them cave, or is that enough to make them unite? That's the question, right? Um, I mean, it really, all bets are off. It could go either way.
Well, to return to my previous point, perhaps I'm putting too much stock in how volatile the situation is. But if there is the expulsion, even to a degree, of Palestinians, once again, we're talking about, I think, about 2 million of the Gaza Strip. Even if a fraction of that is expelled into, say, Egypt and Jordan, it, in many ways, it does force Sisi. It does force, who is it, King Abdullah in Jordan now? I believe it is. I know Hussein was his father, but King Abdullah. Point being, it forces the regimes to either take a harder line on Israel, which is a very dangerous prospect as far as both of them are concerned, or lose their grasp on power, because at that point, not only do you have these displaced people there who have been displaced by Israel, you have the local population, which has no sympathy for Israel, in fact, an intense hatred for them, who are going to be demanding action. And that situation can spill over quite quickly. And
Yeah,
perhaps,
we shouldn't forget the images too.
yes,
Again, I'm sorry to interrupt,
please,
but
please go on.
we shouldn't forget the images of over 1 million Palestinians walking back into the rubble from northern Gaza after everything that's happened, right? Um, I mean, that speaks volumes. Not just, those four. I mean, several. I understand it's a media play that the Hamas military or commandos are performing when they release these Israeli hostages who then go on a stage and thank Hamas. But the fact of the matter is that they seem to have been treated quite well, and this was an absolutely horrible play. Of course, I think Western audience will never be convinced. No matter how many facts you show them. But for the Arab world, and I think maybe for the rest of the planet, that won't be the case. They won't look at it that way because they'll notice, for instance, that one of those four women who was on stage. Remember the videos back in October 2023, and there was a woman that came out of a Jeep or a small SUV, and she had blood on her pants, and people were saying all kinds of things that had happened. Yeah, no, that has not happened. This is her testimony, which contradicts what the American press and the Israeli press have been saying for over a year now. I mean, it's going to be a tough one because I think in many ways, people look at the latest developments in Israel. Some say Israel lost. Some say Israel still won. I mean, Israel, I think, showed that with American support, because if they could never have achieved any of this without America, um, that they are capable of causing an immense amount of destruction over a very sustained period of time. But they went for this deal, and I don't think it was just because Trump was coming into office. I think they did reach their limits this week. For the first time, Israeli troops were attacked in Syria, which has not happened before. Remnants of Hezbollah and loyal Assadis have engaged in armed warfare with some of the other, with the jihadists, essentially, either the Free Syrian Army or HTS. Um, so in any case, but I think Israel still demonstrated that they are still very, very powerful. That America could uh, tighten the spigots of aid going to Ukraine and divert that to Israel. The question is the Israeli public willing to go through this again after everything that has happened, after all the hostages have been returned? And let's not forget that some of this destruction that we saw in Gaza is taking place right now in Jenin in the West Bank, right? And Trump said that he thinks the West Bank should also belong to Israel.
Yes, and
I mean,
part of the agreements with the ceasefire also did include concessions to Israel that lifted sanctions on West Bank settlers. And I do think
Yeah.
another thing to consider in all of this is Netanyahu's precarious position, where let's just start off first and foremost. His health is atrocious. He did come out of his, I believe it was prostate cancer surgery. His legal troubles are only mounting. At this point, what I didn't know was actually that his wife and son are now live in
Yeah.
Florida. They live in Miami now. So
Yeah, and they're not speaking. His son doesn't speak to him apparently.
I didn't know it went that far, but and I know we've speculated also for a number of years that if anything ever goes too wrong for Netanyahu, he is a U.S. citizen. He can always go live at Mar-a-Lago, in which case that might actually be a reality one day. Um, Number two is you already had Ben Gvir pull out of the government coalition. It's just holding on by a thread with Smotrich back in the government. And if Smotrich pulls out of the coalition, then we're looking at another round of Israeli elections, which at this point are not slated for about another year and a half. I believe we're talking that'd be September or October of 2026 is when they have to hold elections next. But with how volatile parliamentary governments can be, if this current coalition falls apart, if Smotrich does follow through with some of the threats that he's been making, this could ultimately force an election. In which case, I know that the previous elections Israel had resulted in a hung parliament, and that was the case for a number of the elections that they've had since 2019. We could see once again Netanyahu either forced to govern from a minority government or just a complete crushing of Likud in the polls, whether that be one of the further right parties that come to power, whether it's the liberal labor faction of the Israeli government. But point being is, I don't think Netanyahu's political position is secured, especially now that the war is over, and an election being forced in Israel sometime this year, especially depending on how Trump and the State Department feel about it, Trump and his people feel about it, could very well be the possibility. Because, look, I think we all know the senior partner in the U.S. Israeli relationship. But rest assured, there are stopgaps the U.S. can pull in order to influence events in Israel, at least to some degree. And I do think that it is within the capability of the Americans at this point, if they really wanted to, if Trump feels really slighted by Netanyahu over something, where he could possibly set off a chain of events that would lead to another round of elections being called.
I mean, it's possible. It reminds me a little bit of Italy, where they have so many frequent elections.
I
All
mean,
of that is,
I was actually just reflecting on this the other day in light of Germany having elections soon, in light of France's hung parliament. The Italians have had a government in power for 2.5 years. Say what you will about Maloney, I think there's a lot of disappointment to go around with that. But point being is, it's unprecedented that the Italians have such stable government while everyone around them is mimicking their politics.
yes, yes. um, what was it? I wanted to. Yes, yes. Now, a lot of this depends on how serious is Trump about the tariffs. So far, we see them as a ploy rather than a means to an end. You know, one of the interesting things that happened about a day after Trump announced that the EU will definitely get tariffs is Macron said he would double spending for the military. Of course, everybody loves to mention that Macron was, worked for the Rothschild bankers, but what they don't know is he also worked for the French American Foundation, um, which was established in 1976. So he's like Annalena Baerbock. He's one of these young leaders who is he's essentially a vassal, like a vassal elite of the U.S. Right? That's his role. So because the whole point of the tariffs, right? Trump's speech, the tariffs are going to make us very rich, very, very rich.
The
I love how
richest we've ever been.
I love I love how he knows how to appeal to the Americans. So, uh, it, of course, the whole point of tariffs is that you already have an industry that you need protecting, right? And of course, every industry requires a lot of engineers. These are two things that the Americans don't have, or don't have enough of. So I don't know how serious he is about these things. I don't know what is it that he actually wants. I think is still very unclear. The
I mean,
Panama thing, of course, is interesting because Panama announced that they're going to cooperate with the U.S. Of course, the U.S. Trump is making it look like the Chinese took over Panama. Like literally, the canal needed to be refurbished, and the Americans refused to do it. I mean, Panama was willing to pay, but the Americans refused to do it. And so there was a firm from Hong Kong that went into a bid, and they won the bid and began refurbishing it. So like, but this is where things get kind of dicey because what if the US, what if even Biden understood that there might be like a retraction, as you say, a retrenchment closer to the home island? And what if the US still wants to go to war with China? What if they believe they need to knock China down a peg in order that they can make this transition, right? Well, in that case, of course, the fear is for the U.S. that if the Chinese shut down the Panama Canal, I mean, honestly, how would they do that? They couldn't just lock it without like U.S. Special Forces literally clearing them out in an hour, right? But I heard one American politician talk about this as if it was an even remote possibility. Um, That said, I think if anything, it would be to block any kind of traffic for, even though 67% of all the traffic are just U.S. ships, is to block any traffic from the Chinese. That's what I think the real intent behind the Panama Canal controversy is
yes,
about.
I think it especially has to do with oil shipments from Venezuela. And
Yes.
it is interesting because you've seen a bit of carrot and a bit of stick from the U.S. on the question of Venezuela, where Rubio actually met with Maduro. Now, the U.S. still holds to its claims that Maduro did not win the election, that he's illegitimate. Yet they're sending now the pretext for Rubio to visit Venezuela and actually have a meeting with Venezuelan government officials was on the grounds of hostage negotiations. And I do, yes, we did get 6 Americans released from Venezuelan prisons. Now, you can imagine the type, of course, the so-called journalists, the humanitarian aid workers who, hey, probably worked with USAID before it got abolished. But once again, you all know the type there. But I can't imagine that was the only reason they sent the Secretary of State down to Venezuela. Because even with countries the United States is on terrible terms with, well, we'll send negotiators, we'll have special envoys, we'll have all kinds of people in order to secure hostage release. And we've even done this with North Korea. We've gotten prisoners released from North Korea. But to send somebody as high level as the Secretary of State does make me believe that there might be something a little more substantial going on. And it could be to the point where we're trying to more or less, I wouldn't exactly say buy out, but bribe the Venezuelan government, even if they want to continue on with, say, the uh, outward appearance of socialism or whatever government or economic structure they might want to have, but under the conditions that they align themselves with American interests. Because I don't think the Americans could care uh, too much about how the Venezuelans run internal affairs, so long as they answer to Washington. It's just in the fact that they have been on good terms with Chinese and to a lesser extent the Russians. That has caused the level of friction with Venezuela. So if they could secure, even if they could turn Maduro into their guy, which I'm not saying is possible, I'm not saying is likely, but if there is that possibility that they could turn Maduro into their guy, I do think that's a large part of why, say, somebody like Rubio would actually go down to Venezuela himself to meet with government officials there and convince him to maybe divest from China.
Uh, oh yeah. I mean, the ultimate prize for them would be Brazil.
Oh, of course.
Yeah.
But that is an interesting question. How, because Lula, and I don't want to get off on too many tangents here, but Lula was very much embedded with the U.S. Democrats. So he was a
Hmm.
very
Hmm.
steadfast friend of those. Yet he also, I think, just because of the political momentum, went along with BRICS. And also, Bolsonaro went along with BRICS. He refused to sanction the Russians, even though he had his rhetoric against China. He also enjoyed a very good relationship with the Russians. So I do think there are certain political forces down in Brazil that do compel them down the path of BRICS, in which case it would require a major overhaul in order for them to divest from that path. However, I still maintain that aside from South Africa, because we all know that's a different question, BRICS is the weakest of the BRICS states that actually matter. And
Right.
it's also the one with closer proximity to the United States, so you could expect activity down there. Uh, but once again, a lot of that remains to be seen. And I do think the pick of Rubio as Secretary of State does signal that there's going to be, and we're already seeing with this with the Home Island reentrenchment, that Rubio as Secretary of State could signal a U.S. pivot to Latin America, which is an area that we've ignored since the end of the Cold War, and that they want to drive out the influences of Latin America, and that they want to reestablish an American hegemony in that part of the world because once again it was neglected in favor of the Middle East, in favor of to some degree the Asia Pacific and also former Soviet Union, where you now have them. You never hear the end of Chinese investments in Nicaragua or Panama or Venezuela. They can go on and on and on about this, even Colombia at this point. So we could see an interesting shift there if the U.S. does continue on this re-entrenchment or retreat path. But that all ultimately remains to be seen.
Hmm.
Um, but I suppose we've covered most of the major topics. And I know that there were a few smaller stories there, but I did want to take this last, I don't know, maybe, 20, 30 minutes of the show here because we are coming up on that. We're, almost at the 2 hour mark here, about a regular episode length. To really just reflect on the first 2 weeks of Trump, which have felt like, frankly, an entire year. I don't know about you guys.
Yeah.
Um, both in terms of domestic policy, foreign policy, the good, the bad, the ugly. What has really come of this? And like I said, it might be a little premature to do this, but I do think because of at what swift speeds things have been moving, that it's worth addressing at this point. And I have to say, uh, well, just starting for me personally, while there has been a lot of positive developments, we've seen, of course, some positive direction on the immigration issue. Perhaps insufficient for some people. I would personally say it's insufficient for my taste. That there does need to be uh, a harder line taken on the issue. It's been significant progress compared, of course, to the past several years. There has been the issue with tariffs, as we brought up earlier in the show, and while I do think theoretically the idea of fostering American industry using economic protectionism does make sense, Trump does seem to be using them as simply a bargaining tool, and that also his policy of tariffs, while also pursuing the line that he does, especially with Russia, especially with the belligerents, it, it's not conducive because the Americans
Hmm.
don't have that kind of industry in order to really support itself. Yet it wants to go completely into the issue of uh, waging trade wars, especially with China. And like I said, while theoretically at this point where the American empire stands, protectionism does make sense on a grand scale, I don't think it's being executed properly. If that is what Trump is trying to accomplish, but frankly, I don't think he's trying to really accomplish anything except uh, more hardline trade negotiations. Uh, of course, on some social issues, particularly the LGBTQ whatever you want to call it, there's been progress on that. There's been a lot of red meat to the conservative base in the United States that I have to say I have enjoyed. Of course, there was the
Yep.
anti-Semitism executive order that we had brought up. That's to be expected. But I still do maintain. I think the anti-Semitism bill is part of this, and I think some of Trump's more belligerent actions are part of this as well. While there are going to be things that are positive, and while there are going to be things that yes you can celebrate, that yes you can take advantage of, there's going to be a price tag attached to these things. And that brings me to one of the other executive orders he signed. I'm not sure whether it was an executive order, but point being, one of the other decisions he made early on in the first 2 weeks in office was offering reinstatement to the members of the military who were dismissed for not taking a certain inoculation, that this platform can still be very selective about enforcement if you mention it. But he did invite them to reclaim their previous rank, previous pay. And at this point, I believe 35,000 U.S. troops former U.S. troops have reenlisted under those grounds after having been dismissed. And this does answer some of the questions with recruitment goals falling short, with the not only in the U.S. but across Western militaries in general, them not being able to fill the ranks. And it does look like this is a way to fill the ranks. And while I don't think that a major military operation is being planned, but if they're going to do something like Gaza, they're going to need more men. If they're going to put that under the auspices of the U.S. military, they need certainly more men with that. And depending on what other military obligations Trump wants to commit the United States to, whether it is closer to home or in the Middle East or anywhere else in the world, uh, the U.S. simply needs to meet its recruitment numbers, needs to meet its troop level numbers. Even if these guys end up sitting at some base in the Netherlands or patrolling the Panama Canal. So there has been that, but ultimately, I'm far from the first person to point this out. A lot of what Trump is doing, he's simply being allowed to do in order to foster confidence that has been lost in the system, particularly over the
Yeah.
last 4 years, but also in a grander scheme in the past 30 years, since the end of the Cold War.
Oh, definitely.
Yes, and like I said, while these things can be positive, and while I think a lot of these things, uh, if there are enough people in certain positions to push these things in the right direction, can be positive in the long term, there's a price tag attached to these things, and I will keep hammering that point home. That does not mean you have to pay it. That does not mean you owe Trump your loyalty. I'll repeat this again. Trump owes you. You do not owe him. But they are allowing certain things to happen, certain good things to happen, I think, just in an objective sense, in order for people who are useful to the regime but disaffected to start feeling more at home again. Start
Hmm.
seeing, say, illegal immigrants being deported, or like I said, some of these social issues being curtailed, or just a number of the issues I had mentioned before. They're trying to make it feel like it's your America again. Yet
Right, right,
it's
right, right.
very
It's worth
superficial.
dying for. Come on, it's worth dying
Exactly,
for.
exactly. And like I said, I'll reiterate the point once again that yes, a lot of these things are good, but as it stands now, especially with them being executive orders that haven't even been challenged by the courts yet, and also have no basis within written law, Congress hasn't acted on it, the courts haven't acted on it. These are very superficial changes thus far. And because of just how nakedly incompetent the last administration is, a lot of people are clamoring to get their hands on anything they can, so they're lapping up these executive orders from Trump. And like I said, we'll see how the legal challenges go. We'll see how Congress decides to act with this. But I wouldn't be surprised if Trump is allowed to implement more elements of his populist agenda in order to, once again, as we have said before, to make our guys feel like it's their America again, even though when you get down to the root of the issue, it still isn't. It still is not.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's very well put. Um, I mean, he's really not someone that can be trusted. But it's still early, but as you've been saying in this on this show so far, it's very schizophrenic. Like, I've watched several programs where they're talking about the tariffs. I mean, I know what tariffs are myself. I want to hear what other people had to say. For instance, I knew that America was largely a tariff-based economy for a very long time,
Well, as a
until
Canadian,
after.
I'm sure you know how painful these tariffs are right now.
Oh yeah,
You're
yeah.
just languishing, I'm sure.
I'm languishing. I told you off air. Um, oh my God, should I buy that MacBook Pro now? Wait a minute. What about bread and butter Pinot Noir? Is that going to skyrocket? That's a good wine. For, for, for $20, you can't beat it. Anyway, so so it didn't happen, but up here there were already some provinces in the Maritimes on the East Coast that already they took American liquor off the shelves. A friend of mine went to a basketball game, and everybody booed, the American team booed during the national anthem. That happened also at a hockey game for the Senators in Ottawa. I mean, Canadians are not happy about this. I saw one guy tweet. He said, we followed you to Afghanistan. We lost 190 some odd guys. Um, and you're slapping, like, we've been your allies for like a century, and you're slapping these tariffs on us. Like, see, this is the hypocritical thing about the whole post-war, post-World War II era, right? Like, America, first of all, lent the money so Europe could, rebuild. And I remember from the last show, we were talking about Russia not paying back. For every $1 that the Russians got, the British got three. Um, in any case, part of the reason the Americans wanted to lend the money, of course, it's an investment. You're going to get a return on that. You're not giving it to them without interest, but you're going to build up these societies again, so you'll have a consumer base to buy your products, right? And of course, all of them had to demilitarize to some degree, right? That was understood. America was not going to tolerate these countries having big militaries again, when American nuclear silos and American troops were on the ground in these countries with very large bases, right?
Also, especially naval presence, where the American Navy
Yes.
at that point was ruler of the seas, undisputed.
So if you look at this really objectively, right? Like, really, you know, they're saying, "Oh, this is so unfair." It's like it was your policy, right? And basically now what you're kind of admitting is you can't afford it. You can't afford your policy. I mean, how much, like, when they say 5% of GDP, that means, like, for Germany, that means like 50% of like government funds that could be spent. Like, Germany cannot afford 50% of all its government funds. Like, what do you want them to do? Do you want them to have a rebellion? You're going to get something. I mean, I don't care if the ADF, in fact, I would prefer if the ADF or, a right-wing government actually did appear in Germany. I like whatever. But you're provoking that to happen, right? You've destroyed their Nord Stream pipeline. Like, how are they going to pay for this? Right? You can't have both. And you're going to punish them with tariffs if they don't do it. I mean, they can't do it. You've partly ruined their economy. And so that now you really can't do it. And it did make me think, like, what if, and I'll get to Denmark in a second, but what if what if Trump was reelected in 2020? Would he have blown up the Nord Stream pipeline? Would he have been able to curtail Merkel or Schultz at that point, from opening it up? It's an interesting question, right? Because there is a continuity of agenda, but there are disagreements in how to best fulfill that agenda. But the agenda doesn't radically differ from admin to admin.
And
But
it has to make you wonder, how long was a demolition plan in place? Because that's not something I think they could have cooked up just during the
yeah,
Biden
5 guys on
administration.
a little yacht. Like, give me a break. I mean, this yacht, when we saw the pictures, it was like, I mean, this isn't even a yacht that a millionaire would own. This is
Excuse me,
literally
it
like
was 5 guys and a woman.
5 guys on a woman. That's right. I forgot. I mean, this is like a fishing vessel. Like, this is nothing big. It's smaller than some of the tugboats. In any case, um, so how are they exactly going to do this, right? Like, why? I mean, the only thing I can think of is you want to impoverish Europe so much, but at the same time contain Russia so you can retract. Like there's something about this that doesn't make sense. And again, we don't know what's happening because Trump may not levy any tariffs, right? That might not happen. I know there's programs out there that are elated with what's happening. And I just saw one from the Duran. Oh my God. Alexander Mercurius is hilarious to watch. He thinks like he is still like he I mean he literally believes like America is some kind of a pinnacle, right? He was comparing Britain, and this is a very interesting point, right, about empires, right? So Britain is at its height in 1890, but its landmass that it controls is at its height 40 years later in 1930. But by 1930, it's obvious Britain is no longer at its peak anymore, and it's on its way down. And so he mentioned now he didn't say this part. He just said that in the beginning of the 20th century, Britain tried to do something like this. And so he's essentially saying that Trump is going to do something and he probably won't make the mistakes that the British Empire did. And it's going to be spectacular. It's going to like I honestly thought like Alexander Mercurius like literally might be the best, like the absolute best Russian disinfo agent ever. Like unironically.
Admit it, you're jealous of his
I'm
optimism.
I'm jealous because I'm thinking like, dude, where are the tariffs? He slapped 10% tariffs on the Chinese that the Chinese have now already retaliated, right? Okay, he's going to drag I don't know how many thousands of patrol office troops to patrol the Mexican US border, right? Okay, they're going to go. How successful are these troops from the Mexicans going to be? I mean, you think Canada has enough resources to do this? Like, it's a ridiculous idea. 1% of fentanyl gets into the U.S. from the Canadian border, and he's made like neither argument is sincere. Like, I think the tariffs eventually will show up because how else is he going to get the money? Like, he's also presuming that the American market is just so important. People will pay like people in the US, because just so people understand how tariffs work, the country that's exporting their goods is not paying the tariff. The the middleman in the US who is buying it in order to sell it in retail or commercially, let's say for certain industries, it could be basic resources, various commodities. They have to front that. They have to pay for that.
Yes, and once again, the tariff implies that there is a competitive domestic industry alternative,
Right. And there
and
isn't.
for many
For many things, there
for
isn't.
many things there are not. You're correct.
Like GM, for instance. Remember GM, how many times it's been bailed out, like Ford, right? Like, so GM, I think something like 42% of the parts that are used in constructing their vehicles in the US are actually made in Mexico and Canada. That's why I've said on the previous shows that it would make sense for some kind of an alignment between Canada, Mexico, and the US, where there wouldn't be a heavy tax burden on those parts coming in, rather than creating more industry in the US. And hear me out why. Because the US is not yet ready to lose the dollar supremacy, the world currency, as it were. Uh, it can't do that right now. And of course, if they want an industry to sell their products abroad, because that's what Trump is saying, the Europeans aren't buying enough American products to do that. Well, you can't have like the most, the highest dollar, the highest denomination in the world, right? Like it doesn't work that way.
Funny enough, you want to see the exact opposite example of this. Japan built itself as an export economy by devaluing its currency. And this is something
Hmm.
Trump also would hammer on about back in 2016. China devalues its currency, Japan devalues its currency because they
Yep,
want to be exporter economies. I know that
that's right.
a few weeks before Trump actually took office, there was floating around where Trump was saying, "Oh, we might want to consider weakening the U.S. dollar." And I mean, yeah, sure, but there's a lot there's a lot of implications to that statement. But ultimately, what I think is happening right now, particularly with the tariff war, while we're focusing on it, is that Donald Trump, being a man fundamentally of the 1980s, is stuck in a very antiquated mindset when I know the 80s was the beginning of the end, 70s, 80s, the beginning of the end of the great American manufacturing powerhouse. But in his mind, it still exists. In his mind, he lives in this idealized version of let's just say 1982 America, where industry is still strong, finance capitalism is going strong. It's all great. I'm the next Ronald Reagan. That kind of rhetoric, and
Right, right. I
it's
remember that.
yeah, it's not a one for one, but just bear with me for the comparison. And he thinks that the United States is in a position to use that leverage where we can call up the Europeans, we can call up the Canadians, the Mexicans, the Chinese, the Japanese, and start making these demands. But once again, we're 40 years removed from that. There has been monumental economic and geopolitical shifts where that simply does not apply. And like I said, while in theory, I might like the idea of tariffs to foster infant industry. You might want to return to the economics of somebody like Friedrich List, who cites actually 1880s America as an example of how to build infant industry with tariffs. And like I said, that's fine, but there are so many other extenuating factors at hand that simply does not make this a viable path forward. When you have spent 40 years offshoring your industry,
Hmm.
there needs to be a substantial effort at reshoring, not the half measures we've had right now, in order to make this happen. I don't know, unless say the plan is to move manufacturing to Vietnam and Indonesia, exempt them from the tariffs while also hammering them down. That could very well be the plan, where it isn't even necessarily a plan to revive American industry, but to put it in more pliable countries, as it were. And I do think that remains to be seen. And like we keep returning to, this is assuming this whole thing doesn't blow over in a month, and that status quo
Hmm.
returns because Trump got whatever minor concessions he was seeking.
Right, right. I have two things to say. One of them is just a ridiculous story. The other one is pertinent to what you're talking about. So back in 2016, when Trump was not elected yet, it was my friend's birthday. It was in the summer, and you brought up the whole, when Trump was campaigning and he was sort of implying that he was the next Reagan, right? uh, the country would be a bit more conservative, but it would be more fiscally responsible, and people will get slightly wealthier. Blah blah blah. Anyways, so what I did is I used Photoshop in a picture of Trump and Reagan, and I designed what would a cake because it was his birthday, and I knew a cake shop that made like custom cakes where he was working. I don't want to dox anybody, but this is a very sort of new hipster area of Toronto for the last 15 years. It's a kind of an old place that has been redeveloped. I went I
Gentrification.
yeah, and I went to this shop, and the owner, like, they're all shit libs in this area. And I went into the shop. Guy looks at me. He looks at, like, because the circle is a certain. I said, if you just plop it on, it would be very easy, right? Like for them to make it, because they have a machine. And anyways, and he says, "Are you serious? You want me to do this?" I go, and I was just on my feet. I go, "It's a joke." And he goes, "Oh, oh, okay." Okay, okay, and he made he made the cake. He made the cake. Yes, my friend was a big fan of Reagan. Anyways, so that's the ridiculous story, and now I've forgotten the more substantive one. But yeah, no, no, do go on. Maybe that'll help
No,
me
I mean, point. Okay.
revive my.
No, I'm glad you brought that up because that was probably more important than the other point, frankly. but
I doubt it.
but
You're
no,
too
no, no.
kind.
I was just saying that yes, theoretically these idea of tariffs make sense, but there's just simply
Yes.
not the infant industry that can be developed. It's all been offshored. It's been offshored for 40 years, and you're not going to bring it back
Yeah.
overnight with that. And it would take a monumental effort to adapt to the world that we live in now in order for this policy to even work, and that's assuming the entire thing isn't just trade negotiations that will blow over in a month after Trump gets whatever minor concessions he's seeking.
Yeah. I mean, I remember when this show first started, and I remember even before I was ever a guest on your show, and I would tell people Trump wants to reindustrialize, he wants to do this. It was very persuasive. Look, I mean, I'm going to be very honest. When I saw that short little video that what's his name Moore did, which was supposed to lambaste Trump, but all it did is create sympathy for him. When he's talking about people living in the Rust Belt, not having decent jobs, death of deaths of despair on the rise, fentanyl, all of that. I mean, it brought a tear to my eyes. Honest to God, I cried over that. And and Trump seemed sort of outside of this, political matrix that we're so used to, that maybe there was a possibility. Maybe there was still a small opening within this system where a guy like him could go in and convince people and so on and so on, right? And I had friends, and you know uh, yes, they were, liberal friends, older than me, who said he can't do it. He can't he can't just reverse 40 years like this. I don't know. I mean, at the time I thought, like, it's possible. It would have to be delicate. It would be one industry at a time. It would have to be gradual. I think even then there was an effort on his part, but there was no. I mean, there was just no relief from the attacks, the cultural war that was going on, that was very real, with violence in the streets even before George Floyd. And all kinds of obstinance and obstacles to any of his programs. And now I don't know. I mean, ultimately it would be preferable. Ultimately, I know that's what Americans would prefer, particularly the Americans that listen to this show. They would prefer that. But the real question is, like, where are the engineers for these industries? Where are, like, I know shale. Okay, shale. Like, it's also plateaued. You can't just do shale. It has to be a lot of different industries, which America used to do. And there's also an interesting kind of maybe a confluence that happened back in the late 70s. If you begin with the idea, right, that the Americans knew that the days of the Soviet Union were numbered, it is around that time that they accelerated deindustrialization. Now, they were already moving towards a financialized economy. But and everybody understands when they accelerated in the 90s. But really, like, a lot of these programs are already starting in the 80s, during Reagan's time. That is when all these automobile factories were closing down.
Yeah, not to reveal too much about my personal life, but uh, my mom's side of the family, we live in the Rust Belt. We've lived in the Rust Belt for, uh, you know, quite some time now. They were devastated in the '80s as the early waves of deindustrialization happened, and you
Yeah.
talk to them this day, they despise Reagan, and like it's
Well,
somebody who doesn't like him. Like it's like I understand, but in a fundamental way, it's visceral. I'll put it that way.
yeah.
But
Yeah.
you're right. It does make sense that if there was the inklings that the Cold War was going to be over soon, that the Soviet Union had exhausted its energies and that it was on the decline on the way out, the idea of continuing this on, especially after the Vietnam War, to return to that, after America needs to rebuild its reputation, in many ways we did that by bribing our allies and, frankly, vassals by giving them industry. We won the favor of Mexico. We won the favor of even some European nations at the time. Now that quickly evaporated. We won the favor of the Japanese by making these trade agreements with them. By
Right. Because investors wanted their returns. I mean, when I mentioned earlier that, GM and Ford have been bailed out by the government more than once each, it's for the investors, it's for the stockholders,
oh,
right? It's
absolutely.
not for anybody else. It's just like the way the banks were bailed out in 2008. Like it's not like, isn't that ironic? First industry, then the banks have to be bailed out. Um, right. I mean, something has happened, right? We'll see what Trump does, but something has happened, and it's probably that the days of just printing endless money cannot keep going on.
No, and I think Rubio's comments are key in that because him admitting that the unipolar world is over. We're talking about the poster boy of PNAC. You know, his campaign slogan the first time around was "For a New American Century." That's how on the nose it was. When those guys are starting to admit that American hegemony is not a guarantee, in fact, that it might even be over, then yes, there is going to be a quite a radical restructuring, which I think I found my episode title, but um, that is going to have long-lasting ramifications. And like I said, I agree with everything you're saying right here. I just wanted to put that out there to bolster that point.
I can't believe you're not going to use Ronald Reagan Trump birthday cake as the title, but go whatever. It's
No,
your
no
show.
we got to save that for like a milestone episode. I'm not look.
Can you imagine such a ridiculous title?
I'm saying the only way a title like that would work is if it's followed with at Giant R Productions.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah, we can't snub Geo like that. He has to be on an episode with such a title.
Absolutely. We
But
have to have Geo also, for even though I'm a Canadian. Um,
the your diaspora, you don't count. We need the real
I'm
Canadian
yeah, I am.
perspective.
I am. I
That's
am
like
diaspora.
obviously I'm a bit more entrenched in say America than you are in Canada, but that's like asking me for like the American perspective. I'm not the aggregate. I'm not saying Geo's the aggregate because I know Canada's a, but he's got his ear much more on the ground with the Canadian issues than I would say either of us. And you live
Oh yeah,
there.
absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah. Hey, you want to ask us about Central and Eastern European politics? Yeah, we got it. You want to ask us about Canadian politics? I don't know, man.
Well, up here, you have people blaming Trudeau for this, and you know, I mean, I don't like Trudeau. I hate him, but I don't think. I mean, obviously, there's a bit of revenge. Trump, wants, I think, some kind of revenge on Trudeau. He doesn't want to humiliate him before he leaves office. However, the guy that's probably going to replace him, I can never pronounce his name, Polivier.
I think
Um,
Polyev. I'm not a
yeah,
Frenchman though,
something
but
like that. Um, he also said, Canada's not for sale. Canada will never be, on and on and on and on. But I just think this was an inevitability, that if Trump is serious about these tariffs, if he's serious about reindustrializing Canada, then this was inevitable no matter which prime minister Canada happened to have. Right? Like, Trudeau didn't do anything so horrible that it made Trump do this. Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
Like, it's just it's geopolitics. It's nothing personal. It's just geopolitics.
And one thing I will add with that is, of course, Trump is a exceedingly petty man, so none of that is really to be some shocking to anyone. But I do think, and this is not to be the role of the American triumphalist, because, and I think those of you who have listened to the show know that uh, I think the idea of America as a great power is on the decline. I have my criticisms of the American empire to its core. But at the end of the day, Canadian politics is pretty irrelevant to the point. I know
Oh yeah.
I joked about this earlier, but once again, the politics of like the Czech Republic and Hungary are more relevant to the state of the world than Canadian politics, frankly.
Yeah. Yeah, because I mean, ultimately Canada will go along with it, I think. The only way it could not happen, and this is something else I've wanted to mention, and that is, I think that Trump is not by any means out of the woods. I think there is going to be a quote unquote, a deep state reaction to this. And, Musk's attempt to get rid of Stammer, right, as a way of changing Britain and therefore changing Europe, um, might not work. I don't know. It's still early, but I imagine there's going to be some kind of resistance to what Trump is attempting to do, even though it's still not quite clear yet. And he might be being intentionally ambiguous and schizophrenic.
Yes, I agree. And one thing I will say on that, I know I've talked about this idea before, but the last thing I will say is the idea of the deep state being at war with itself is not an impossibility. And I do think that you do have some people in the regime, the deep state, whatever you want to call it, who are willing to embrace Trump's changes in order to once again re-entrench itself, versus the die-hard believers who think any departure from post-Cold War liberalism is you might as well throw away the American empire at that point. So we'll see what the backlash to that will be. We'll see if they start to fall in line. But once again, Trump has been cleaning house at a lot of these agencies, at pretty much anything under his purview, where agencies are losing funding, people are being fired. The FBI has been taken to the cleaners, frankly. And I'm not
Oh,
saying who the replacements will necessarily be once again our guys, but we're talking about the dismissal of several agents involved in the investigations of the January 6th cases. So he is.
that was probably the best thing he's done.
Oh, yeah, I agree. And I will give him all the credit in the world for that, if nothing else. But I do expect this to continue because I'll say it once again for the sake of us being at the tail end of the show. For a radical restructuring to take place, all these things need to happen, and some people are going to need to be sidelined because that. Some people are going to need to be forced into retirement. We saw the proposed buyout for federal employees, where Trump was saying, "We will pay you the most generous severance package in the world if you just get out of here, so we can abolish your position, so we can get government bloat under control." So that might be actually what's going to be like going forward. Of course, these people will have golden parachutes. They'll have all kinds of jobs in the private sector. They will not be hurting, point being.
Yeah.
But I do think that for good or for ill, we're starting to see these changes taking place in order to re-entrench the American empire, so it has a fighting chance in a much more volatile world, a more volatile world than I think any of us can even remember, even beyond the Cold War. I think we're returning to a proper set of great power politics in the world.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And it's going to be interesting. I mean, we've speculated on this for ages. What are because we've always imagined this point of time coming, for the US. So what are the other little countries that depended so much on U.S. aid and the National Endowment for Democracy, what are they going to do now that they're going to be uh, left out in the cold, as it were, as America retrenches itself?
And I think I'll make my most bold prediction I've probably made on the show. Maybe not so much in Europe because I think a lot of questions have been settled there, except a few big ones, of course, that are still going on. But more in the Middle East and Africa, I think, is where you'll see this, and even some parts of Asia. I do think we are seeing within the next 10 years a possibility of borders being redrawn on the map in a significant sense, especially as China gets more involved in Africa, gets more involved in parts of the Middle East, and also in other parts of Asia as well. These places, as you said, that relied on the soft power apparatus of the United States, we could very well see, depending on, say, what the economic interests of whoever has their eye on Africa's resources, its strategic locations, and I know that one of the one of the things that was speculated Trump was going to do is going to recognize Somaliland, which is one of the breakaway provinces of Somalia. I'm not sure if that ever actually happened. And as ridiculous as that sounds, you could see changes like that, where if not the U.S., China, they do recognize separatist movements, or say everyone turns a blind eye to annexations. There's a recent bout in the war going on between Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where
Yeah,
actually
yeah.
Romanian mercenaries got left high and dry by the guys that they trained, and you had the Congolese capture like 200 Romanian mercenaries. So
That was a crazy
yeah.
story.
So while we don't cover those things, there are these low-level latent conflicts going on across
Yeah,
the world. And if we are truly in an age of great power politics, if those are in parts of the world that say are geographically significant, have significant resources, we very well could see these sort of conflicts become the new imperial adventures of, say, a country like China. And I think China, that's just a rough example because I think they're a bit more conservative with their foreign policy in general. Or if the Americans go against Brzezinski's prediction and do follow the Chinese in Africa, which I don't think is going to happen. Or let's say the French want to do it, but I think at this point, Africa is mostly the domain of Russia and China, particularly through economic contracts. But will there be a challenger? Who knows at this point? But point being is, as the world grows more multipolar, to borrow the term that everyone loves to use, you're going to see probably more of these little conflicts, not necessarily flare up, but brought to the forefront. They're suddenly going to become a lot more relevant.
yeah.
Issues of trade routes and tariffs and taxation, all these things that we've taken for granted the Americans control the seas and control trade, and that therefore things are peaceful, that's going to become a lot more relevant. And to return to one of my other outlandish predictions from about 4 or 5 years ago, the idea of high seas piracy becoming more common again, if there are genuine trade rivalries, if there are genuine trade blocks, if there are rival empires, of course none of them are going to attack each other directly. We could see a upswing in piracy, in
Hmm.
sabotaging of trade vessels. We saw, I think we got a foretaste of that with the disputes between the United States and Iran over oil tankers back in 2019. I think that was a preview of the kind of activity that is to come in a more divided, more multipolar world.
Yeah, just two things that you've reminded me just now, and that is, I never did say the the th- the thing I wanted to bring up about Denmark, and that is Denmark is in talks now with Russia to restore Nord Stream. Eh,
So now the Europeans recognize the importance of diversifying their investments, diversifying their trade
Right,
partners.
right.
When Joe Biden is there, it's all fine. But now that Trump has bad optics and is demanding that Europe render under the American empire, now we have to do something about it. You know what? I'm glad that Europe is trying to take an independent course. Perhaps I'm speaking too soon, but this does, and we'll see how this turns out. I do hope that energy infrastructure is restored between Europe and Russia. I think that is a necessary move for Europe, and I do think it is a major leap forward towards peace and stability in Europe, frankly. But once again, is this going to turn out to be Macron who ends up kissing the feet of the American empire once again? Who knows? But I would love to see this happen. Like I said, I think it would be a very positive development for everyone involved. But I do love it. It did strike me as funny that after everything has happened,
Yeah.
we're finally discussing
Right. Of,
European-Russian energy cooperation.
that's right. Blum said, "I'm going to take Greenland." They say, "Start Nord Stream 2." Because, of course, one of those four pipelines is still active. It's, I mean, not active, but it's still operable. The other is, with this money disappearing, guys like Orban have if this is for real, right? It's still early. He's only been in office for 2 weeks. It's still very early. And like we said, we expect the backlash. But if all things keep going in the direction that they're going in, guys like Orban have literally outlasted, um, let's say the gay, global homo, if you will. Um,
Victoria Nuland's life work is in ruins.
yeah, because Samantha Power was has lost her job. Yes, today her
Yes.
she closed down her Twitter account. She was after Newland, she's like the queen of regime change. Remember, she went to Hungary
Uh,
and
how could I forget?
so it's amazing. Guys like Orban have made it by the skin of their teeth, and Fisco now,
Yeah,
Fisco,
yeah.
Fico.
Fizzo. And like I said, um, I don't know if I want to touch on this episode because I really haven't formulated my thoughts, but Vucic, I know that some of the Serbs I've talked to, that there is genuine discontent with Vucic and that they do view him as a spineless coward. In many ways, he is. And that at a lot of these protests, actually, people with EU flags have been shouted down and been expelled from the protests. So that one's a little bit more up in the air, and I still haven't
It
figured out
is,
what it is because it does seem like it might
and
actually be genuine nationalist energy behind that, not just some color revolution nonsense.
well, remember that spirit cooking woman from 2016,
Abramovich,
Abramovich.
ugh.
So she and Madonna are supporting the protests. Like, yeah, these protests to me are still iffy,
Oh, I agree. I agree. I
and I think it might be too early right now for to oust Vucic. Right. I think if things keep going in the direction that they're going in, it might be better to just keep him,
yeah,
and
I
because
agree.
a
I
lot of
agree.
the constraints that he has had to deal with, and the pressures from the EU, could be diminished significantly.
Yes, and I think that status quo is best for now. I do remember you told me about the Abramovich thing, so there clearly are subversive elements involved in these protests.
Yeah,
But I don't think this one glows quite like, say, Slovakia or Georgia by any means.
yeah, yeah.
But like you said, I think they're still too young and volatile in order to really establish what these protests are about. In which case, that's when these kind of things are usually hijacked. So it's that
That's the number one thing I'm afraid of.
yeah, it's that critical moment. Is this going to be um, genuine discontent, genuine demands of the Serbian people of their government, or is this going to be yet another uh, glow in the dark operation? But with U.S. aid being abolished, with it seems like a change towards the color revolution industry, that could even if they do want to support, even if they do take in that direction, the delay, the uncertainty might be enough to snuff out that energy. Fortunately,
Yeah,
so
yeah,
that all remains to be seen. But that is all I had for today.
yeah. Me as well. If we have George on the show, I've got a great sort of thing that we can do on not just pipelines but trade routes,
Oh,
and
wonderful!
a port being proposed to be built in Georgia by the Georgians. Anyways, I saw this in the Wall Street Journal. So anyhow, um, hopefully it will be. I'll discuss it on a future episode that we
Certainly,
could
and
host shortly.
yeah, we'll have a regular circuit of guests on there, and I may or may not be in talks with a former guest who I think I could get to come back on the show. It's been a while. You'll probably know who he is. I don't want to reveal anything yet, but I think you know what I'm talking
Yeah.
about.
Oh yeah, I know.
I definitely do need to get more in touch with them about that because we've been talking lately, just not about that. But thank you everyone for tuning in to another episode of the War Report. We'll see you guys next time, and goodbye.
Goodbye and take care.